Jeserich. I am pleased to welcome to the radio program today Kai Bird for a conversation on nuclear weapons, the threat of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, and also a conversation on the history of nuclear weapons. Kai Bird won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for a book that he co-authored called American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer has been labeled as, quote-unquote, the father of the atomic bomb. Kai Bird is also a member of the editorial board with The Nation magazine, where he has an editorial called Not Even Nuclear War Will Stop the Fighting in Ukraine. He is a historian, a journalist, and also executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. Kai Bird, a very good morning to you, sir.
Good morning to you, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be with you.
What prompted you to write this editorial for The Nation magazine, again called Not Even Nuclear War Will Stop the Fighting in Ukraine?
Well, the editor at The Nation, Don Guttenplan, asked me to do it after we had a conversation about what's going on in the Ukraine. And I'm sure that his invitation was prompted by Putin's recent statement, where he gave a sort of veiled threat that he might someday use one of these weapons. And that has generated a lot of speculation about what would happen if a tactical, so-called battlefield weapon was used in the Ukraine. And so I sat down and began thinking about it. And, it comes straight out of my work as a biographer on Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. And, he understood from the very beginning that these are weapons that cannot be used on a battlefield. And I quote him at one point saying in a speech just 3 months after Hiroshima, in a speech that he gave in Philadelphia in 1945, the pattern of the use of atomic weapons was set at Hiroshima. The Hiroshima bomb, he pointed out, was used, quote, against an essentially defeated enemy. It is a weapon for aggressors, and the elements of surprise and terror are as intrinsic to it as are the fissionable nuclei. So what he was saying was that, however small the weapon is designed, an atomic bomb needs a large target. There is no military target for a tactical nuclear weapon. Even a 1 kiloton nuclear weapon used on the battlefield in the Ukraine would have a burn radius of nearly half a mile. And, there are no targets that large that are, strictly speaking, military. So it's insane.
And thinking about the size of impact, today, what we call tactical nuclear weapons, these are supposed to be smaller nuclear weapons than the ones that the United States and the Soviet Union were developing in the Cold War that could completely wipe out a city. Now we have what's called, quote unquote, tactical nuclear weapons. I remember when I was a Capitol Hill reporter covering a lot of the push for developing so-called bunker busters that the United States was pushing in the previous decade. Maybe we'll even talk about those as well. But compare for me the atomic bomb that was dropped on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki to these so-called tactical nuclear weapons that theoretically could be used today.
Right. Well, the Hiroshima bomb was about 15 kilotons, the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. And, they've designed these so-called tactical weapons that could be as small as 1 kiloton. But actually, the U.S. arsenal of tactical weapons, we probably have around 200 of these. And many of them are like the size of a Hiroshima bomb. And of course, during the Cold War, as you mentioned, the United States and the Soviet Union designed hydrogen bombs that were, 100 kilotons. they would, take out all of New York City and more. So these are, as Oppenheimer argued, they're not battlefield weapons. They are weapons only of terror. They're psychological. And that's, of course, what Putin is sort of banking on, I think, when he, in veiled threats, talks about using these weapons. He wants to change the psychology of the war narrative in the Ukraine and force the Ukrainian government in Kiev to surrender, or at least have a ceasefire and leave the Russians in occupation of whole portions of eastern Ukraine. And I don't know, the way the war is going now, this is the Ukrainians are fighting back, resisting. They are the defenders against a war of aggression. And they have momentum on their side. And so that's the danger. We're looking at Putin being pushed into the corner, and he may well use these weapons, or at least demonstrate one, to try to change the psychology of the whole narrative and to terrorize Kiev. But I don't think it'll work. And I worry very much that we're getting into sort of an August 1914 scenario, which is how World War I started, where all the parties on either side sort of miscalculated the intentions of their adversary. And they stumbled into a war that no one wanted and no one expected, and it was an accidental war. And we could do the same thing here in the Ukraine, and things could get out of hand. If Putin uses a tactical weapon on a so-called military target, I hope that the United States does not respond. We should never initiate another nuclear war. Instead, the Ukrainians will probably be outraged at the use of such a weapon, and they will double down, and the Americans will probably double down and send even more conventional weapons. Anyway, I hope we don't get into an exchange of nuclear weapons, because that could actually escalate rather rapidly into a devastating exchange in Europe, and who knows, maybe on continental America. It's a nightmare scenario.
What are your thoughts in how the United States has responded to this veiled threat?
Well, President Biden has taken the long expected and traditional response of ambiguity. He's, not saying exactly what he would do. And this is part of our military doctrine, where we Americans have always refused to pledge no first use. We won't even do that. The notion is that these weapons they're part of our arsenal, and their use is deterrence, and deterrence is only good if the enemy doesn't know what you're going to do. That's the thought. But I fear just the opposite. I fear, as I just mentioned, an August 1914 scenario where one party does something out of desperation and the other party responds in kind, and we stumble into a war that no one really wanted. So I think instead of ambiguity, the Biden administration should make it very clear that we will not respond in kind to the use of a tactical weapon, and that we will respond instead with even more severe economic embargoes and conventional arms to the Ukrainians to defend themselves. And we will make sure that the Russian state becomes a pariah to the rest of the world. We could indict Putin we should make all these threats and make them very clear today before anything gets escalated any further. But we should pledge that we're not going to respond in kind, because that's the real danger, an accidental war.
You think those would be more effective then? Again, as you pointed out, the whole idea up to now and the doctrine has been deterrence, and what would keep Putin from using a tactical nuclear weapon would be for the United States not to use one. Or if he did use one, then the United States could use one as well.
Well, if we go down that road, I fear, we will end up pushing ourselves into a corner, and we'll feel compelled to respond to his use of a tactical weapon with one of our own. And I think that's insanity. Instead, we should make it very clear to him that we think that these weapons are not battlefield weapons and that they cannot change the course of the war. And therefore, if he uses one, we will simply double down on our conventional arms deliveries to the Ukrainians. We will indict him as a war criminal. We will close down the all Russian trade. We will go to the Chinese and the Indians and say, you cannot, deal with this man. He's a madman. We'll completely isolate him. We'll make all those threats, and perhaps that would be a deterrent. But I don't think threatening in advance and threatening to use a tactical weapon, if he does, is going to deter him from doing this. It's a psychological, it's, again, as Oppenheimer said, these are weapons of terror. They're not battlefield weapons.
Let's talk about Robert Oppenheimer. When he was working on developing the atomic bomb with the Manhattan Project, were they also thinking about how to produce smaller nuclear weapons that potentially could be used? I mean, obviously they did use the two in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but was this an issue in his time?
No, it was not. They were simply trying to create the first such weapon. And Oppenheimer's motivation was very much that he believed that the Germans were winning the race to create atomic bombs. He had studied physics in Germany himself as a young man, and he was friends with Werner Heisenberg, who was presumed to be the German physicist who was leading the German bomb project. So he knew perfectly well that Heisenberg and his colleagues were capable of understanding the potential of an atomic weapon and how to build it. And he thought that they had started before the Americans, and so that they were ahead in the race. And he was a man of the left. He feared fascism, and he feared that the German physicists might actually give the atomic bomb to Hitler, and that he would, win the war with it. So he was desperate to build this thing. Interestingly enough, at the end of 1943, the last day of 1943, Niels Bohr, the famous physicist of quantum physics from Denmark, arrived in Los Alamos on a plane. And he gets off the plane, and the first thing he says to Oppenheimer is, "Robert, is it big enough?" And what Niels Bohr meant was, is it big enough to make sure that we never fight such a war again, that it will end all, the possibility of total warfare as they were experiencing in World War II. He thought of it as a weapon, that would make it impossible to fight such a war again, because it was so large and devastating. And Oppenheimer was actually intrigued by that argument. And towards the end in the spring of 1945, when they knew they were very close to being able to test the weapon at the Trinity site, which happened in July. At that moment, they could see from the newspaper headlines, the war in Europe was virtually over. Hitler was being defeated, and the physicists, the younger physicists at Los Alamos, actually held a meeting in one of the auditoriums to discuss why were they rushing to build this weapon when they now knew that the Germans were defeated. And they didn't think that the Japanese had a bomb program. And so what was the point of all this? And Oppenheimer got up and used Niels Bohr's argument that, no, we have to continue, we have to demonstrate this weapon in this war, because otherwise humanity will not understand the Armageddon-like nature of the weapon, and the next war would be fought with, to the surprise of everyone, with nuclear weapons. So Robert Oppenheimer wanted his men to understand that it was important to at least test this weapon in this war, and he was perfectly willing to use it on Japan. Anyway, he then, to come back to your question about tactical weapons, after World War II, Oppenheimer became very worried about a nuclear arms race and the military's natural desire to build bigger and bigger weapons. And some of his colleagues, like Edward Teller, were anxious to build a hydrogen bomb, which Oppenheimer thought was totally useless and unnecessary. Just an atomic weapon was large enough. And so he began to make the argument, well, actually we should be thinking in Washington. He'd go to the policymakers in Washington and say, maybe we should be thinking about smaller weapons that could actually be used on the battlefield. So he actually bought into the notion that maybe these could become battlefield weapons. But I think this was an argument he advanced only because of his fear of 100 kiloton hydrogen bomb and the madness of building a weapon that could take out New York City and half of New Jersey in one blow. And of course, this is why he was put on trial in a kangaroo court in 1954, because he was leading the opposition to building more. He opposed the building of the hydrogen bomb. And for this reason, his political enemies in Washington decided to bring this guy down and question his patriotism and launched this sort of secret trial of him in 1954.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Kai Bird. Kai Bird won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for the book that he co-authored, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Kai Bird is also an editorial member with The Nation magazine, where he has an editorial called Not Even Nuclear War Will Stop the Fighting in Ukraine. So it's with the movement towards a hydrogen bomb that has Robert Oppenheimer, I guess, have a change of heart towards this. It wasn't in the aftermath of the atomic bombing of Japan. Did he have a reaction to what happened in Japan?
Oh, yes. He was a very complicated, sensitive soul. And as I said, he worked very hard to build this weapon in only 2.5 years because he feared that Hitler would get it first. But on the eve of the Japanese bombings, one day he was walking to work with his secretary at the time, and she overheard him muttering to himself, and she got closer and leaned in and said, "Robert, what are you saying?" And he says, those poor little people. And she said, "What do you mean?" And he explained, the bomb, if it was going to be dropped on Japan, was going to hit cities and the victims were going to be mostly women and children. He understood that, and it troubled him. On the other hand, that same week, he met with some of the bombardiers who were going to be on the planes dropping the bombs, and he instructed them exactly, at what altitude the weapon should be exploded. And
he knew where they were going to be dropped.
And he knew that it was going to be dropped on a city or two. And he instructed them, aim at the middle of the city. He knew exactly what was necessary if you wanted to demonstrate the power of this weapon. Anyway, when he actually read the news of what had happened in Hiroshima, this plunged him into a deep depression. We know this from letters that his wife, Kitty, wrote to friends saying she feared for Oppenheimer's life, that he was so down. And he essentially spent the next few years trying to find a way to convince the politicians in Washington to control this weapon and not to rely upon it as a military weapon. He was very sensitive to the dangers of what he had himself created.
You said he was a man of the left. Tell me about that.
Oh, he was, like many university professors and intellectuals in the 1930s, he was horrified by the Depression and the toll it had taken on most Americans. And he was sympathetic he was a professor at Berkeley, and he was sympathetic to the Communist Party's efforts to desegregate public pools, for instance. He was sympathetic to the cause of the Republican, the Spanish Republic and the Spanish Civil War that started in 1936.
Well, what does sympathetic mean in these cases?
Well, he gave money. Every year he gave about $300 to $400 a year to various Communist Party causes, like buying an ambulance to ship to this Spanish Republic, or organizing campaigns to desegregate institutions like public pools in the Berkeley, San Francisco area. There's a great debate about whether he actually joined the Communist Party or not, or was just a sort of fellow traveler. And this, of course, is what partly was focused on during the Kangaroo Court of the 1954 trial. But my co-author and I, Marty Sherwin, who died last year at the age of 84, we struggled really hard to figure out where the evidence led on his party membership. And we concluded that he was not the kind of guy who was ever going to submit himself to party discipline, and that he never actually, there's no party card. He didn't appear on any Communist Party rosters. He attended Communist Party meetings. He knew some of his closest friends were members of the party. Indeed, his wife, Kitty, had once been a card-carrying member. His brother was a member of the party. But we think he never actually joined. But he was a man of the left. And in a sort of typical sense, a man of the left from the 1930s. And of course, his political views evolved. But he was certainly, he was an intellectual.
But when he's attending these meetings, these are in the 1930s.
Yes.
When he's showing some kind of involvement with the Communist Party, not early 1940s, not the start of World War I.
No, I think by the start of World War II.
World War II, yeah.
Yeah, he was more and more concerned with trying to, he wanted to join the army at one point when he wanted to fight. But he was a man in his 30s at that point, and he was by 1939 he was well aware that the that building an atomic weapon of some sort was a real possibility. And so when General Leslie Groves came out to Berkeley looking to recruit someone to be the scientific director of this project, Oppie really wanted that. That's what people called him, Oppie, his closest friends. Oppie really wanted to do this. He had great ambitions, and he thought he was the right guy to do it. In fact, he was.
Yeah. Yeah. What, he thought he was fighting fascists. Is that why?
Yes.
Yeah. Why did the government see him as the guy to lead this? And why do you say he was the guy, the right guy?
Well, it's very curious. General Groves, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, starting in about 1942, they were complete opposites. He was, sort of a gruff, masculine, no nonsense general who had fairly conservative political views. But he was trying to wrap his head around quantum physics and figure out how to build this weapon. And his job was to recruit scientists. And when he met Oppenheimer, really just by chance in Berkeley, he understood that this was a physicist who actually could speak English and could explain in plain language what was necessary. And Oppenheimer had a notion of how to do it. And he told Groves, it's not a matter of physics. We know the physics. It's an engineering problem. And you need to, instead of having laboratories spread all over the country, you need to bring everyone who you want working on this project together in one place. And he suggested, why don't you put them in New Mexico and in an isolated small town surrounded by barbed wire so that you would have absolute security and you could control who goes in and goes out. But inside the barbed wire, there would, these scientists would be able to freely discuss the problems they faced and figure out solutions. And this would be the fastest way to. So General Groves, who had a real concern about keeping everything secret, the security of the operation, thought this was a brilliant notion. And he saw that Oppenheimer also was extremely ambitious, very smart. And as I said, he was that rare kind of physicist who also loved French poetry and Hemingway novels, and he could appreciate literature, and he could explain things to someone like Groves in plain English. And he was charismatic in an odd way. So even though Oppenheimer at this point in his life, he's like 34 years old, and he's never administered more than a dozen graduate students, had no administrative skills to speak of, no experience in this vein. Nevertheless, to the surprise of everyone, General Groves selected him to be the scientific director. And it turned out to be a brilliant decision because everyone agrees in retrospect that the project building an atomic bomb in Los Alamos would have taken much longer if anyone else had been in charge, because Oppie was the kind of guy who could actually inspire chemists and physicists and engineers to come together and solve problems. And he was an inspiration, and he got everyone to work very hard. and to produce this in a record time, 2.5 years.
There is a moment, and I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but a moment that is well remembered of him quoting the Bhagavad Gita when he saw the test of the atomic bomb. What's the actual story of that?
Well, the New York Times reported that Oppenheimer, upon seeing the results of the Trinity test, sort of mumbled to himself this line from the Gita, I am death, destroyer of worlds. Well, actually, what happened was he saw the explosion. He was with his brother, Frank. They were lying flat on the desert floor. They looked up, they saw they were looking at it through dark pieces of glass. And he said to Frank, it worked. But Oppenheimer had a sense of drama. And later, when talking to the New York Times reporter who had been seconded to report on this, he came up with that line. And, he had a flair for drama. He was sort of an actor.
but made up afterwards.
He made that up afterwards. Yeah, absolutely. But that line has become, his signature line about talking about the weapon. And actually, it's an interesting line because it is appropriate, but many Sanskrit scholars actually think that the correct translation of that line should be not "I am death, destroyer of worlds," but from the Gita, if you understand the context of it should be "I am time, destroyer of worlds," which fits more with the sort of religious context of the Gita. But in any case, it was a good line. It worked.
And meaningful, even if he didn't say it immediately after the testing.
Right.
He still he meant it.
He meant it. Yes.
He said, yeah, interesting. He also made great contributions to our understanding of the universe, including black holes. I guess these are things that I guess his development of the atomic bomb and his role in that has overshadowed somewhat these other things. Did he come to regret that?
I think he did. But he was a polymath. As I said, he loved French poetry and literature, and in his physics work, he in Germany, when he studied quantum physics for the first time with Max Born at the university in Göttingen, he was brilliant, and he could write a physics paper very quickly, and made real contributions to the science. But he didn't have the patience to sit with one idea any very long. He was so quick and smart that he would capture the notion of the discovery, and then he'd move on to some other issue. So in 1939, he wrote a paper, very short paper, about 15 pages, with one of his grad students. And he just predicted on the basis of theory and the mathematics that black holes must exist. Now, no one had ever even heard of black holes. But he posited, well, if this is the way quantum works in the universe at large, then at some point there must be black holes. We can't see them. I can't prove that they exist, but here's the mathematics, here's the theoretical physics, and they must exist. And then he moved on from it. He didn't do any more work on black holes ever. But it wasn't until, the late 1960s that we had the X-ray telescopes powerful enough to be able to actually find physical evidence of black holes. So he was, brilliant. He should have, gotten a Nobel Prize for his work on black hole theory, but it never happened. And then World War II came along, and he famously said, physics ended. No work on physics was done during World War II. There were no new discoveries. It was all using quantum physics to simply do the engineering that resulted in creating the atomic bomb.
Applying what was already known.
Yeah, it was already known by 1939.
And that's why there was a race, because it was known. The question is, how do you apply it? How do you engineer it and make it happen?
Yeah, right. The Germans knew it. The British scientists knew it. Even Japanese scientists who had studied quantum physics understood that this was, if you could have fission, then you could theoretically create a bomb. So then it became a large engineering problem.
Again, we are in conversation with Kai Bird. Kai Bird won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for the book that he co-authored, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. He is a member of the Nation's editorial board, which is in The Nation magazine, where he has an editorial called Not Even Nuclear War Will Stop the Fighting in Ukraine. Also worth noting, the book American Prometheus is being made and has been made and will be shown next year as a major motion film, which is exciting, and congratulations on that. Can you referenced earlier what would happen to Robert Oppenheimer after World War II and what you call a kangaroo trial against him. Can you tell me more about what happened after World War II, and when did the fallout, no pun intended, yeah, it really wasn't, but when did things start to get difficult between him and the government?
Well, it's a tragic story. Robert Oppenheimer in 1945, 46, 47, he was a national celebrity. He was probably the most famous American scientist, aside from Albert Einstein. His image was on the cover of Time and Life, and he was known as the father of the atomic bomb, and celebrated for his smarts and as I said, he was extremely charismatic and photogenic, and he became the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, where he was actually Albert Einstein's boss, nominally. And he became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission at the time in the late 40s. And he used that position and his position at the Institute for Advanced Studies and his celebrity as a famous physicist to try to educate the public about the dangers of atomic weapons. And as I mentioned, he opposed the development of the bomb, the hydrogen bomb, in the late 40s and early 50s. And that gave him that created political enemies, because the Air Force and the Army were vying to put, in fact, more money into the development of larger and bigger atomic weapons. And Oppenheimer, famously in October of 1945, he got a meeting with President Harry Truman. And he went into the Oval Office determined to try to pitch to the president the dangers of these weapons and the need to establish international controls so that no one would go down the road of an atomic arms race. And he's got halfway through his little pitch to Truman, and Truman interrupted and said, "Well, Dr. Oppenheimer, when do you think the Russians are going to be able to get a bomb?" And Oppenheimer was sort of a little stunned. He said, he hesitated. He said, "I'm not quite sure." And Truman said, "Well, I know, never." Truman thought that the Russians were incapable of developing an atomic bomb. And Oppenheimer knew at that moment that Truman had no understanding of what was going on, and he in his so startled at Truman's response, he responded himself by saying, "Well, Mr. President, you don't understand. We have blood on our hands." And this, of course, was exactly the wrong thing to tell Harry Truman, who, ostensibly had to make the decision to use those two atomic bombs on Japanese cities. And he quickly ended the meeting and later told one of his aides, I don't want to ever see that crybaby scientist again. So Oppie had a tendency to, for dramatization and a tendency to insult people above him in positions of power who were, he thought, ignorant. And anyway, this is all leading up to why he was put on trial. He did this repeatedly to people in Washington who he thought were ignorant and didn't understand the dangers of these weapons or didn't understand quantum physics. And so he created many enemies, one of which was Lewis Strauss, who Dwight Eisenhower, when he became president, appointed as head of the Atomic Energy Commission. And Strauss was insulted by Oppenheimer at one point. They had bad personal chemistry, and Strauss got it into his head that Oppie was a danger to the nuclear security establishment, that maybe he was a spy because of his left-wing politics. And so he orchestrated a security hearing to determine whether Oppenheimer should have his security clearance stripped of him as a danger. And there was a trial that took place in April of 1954 in Washington. It was in camera, in secret. And they eventually decided that, well, Oppenheimer was probably an American patriot, but he was nevertheless a security risk, and they stripped him of his security clearance. And it was a very humiliating experience for Oppie. And then they leaked the entire proceedings to the New York Times. And so there were headlines splashed across the country announcing that the father of the atomic bomb had been stripped of his security clearance as a security risk. And, the implication was that he was maybe a spy or at least a security risk. And this is, of course, at the height of McCarthyism, 1954. And so he became, he went from being one of America's leading public intellectuals to becoming a pariah. Universities disinvited him from speeches that they had invited him to give. He could no longer give the government advice about nuclear weapons. And it destroyed his life in many ways.
This, as the United States, both the United States and the Soviet Union are developing more and bigger nuclear weapons.
And this happened, during the 1950s when Dwight Eisenhower was relying on nukes as sort of a cheap defense. And again, we got into exactly what Oppenheimer feared, a nuclear arms race where we built tens of thousands of these weapons on both sides. And indeed, we lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought us to the very brink of a nuclear war, and one that could have accidentally happened, as we now know in retrospect.
Robert Oppenheimer would die in 1967, so he's alive in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did he ever speak about that or write about that?
He did not speak about it. Again, he was no longer allowed a public platform. And he did not, he lived through the missile crisis. I'm sure he was personally horrified by how close we came. But we didn't even realize at the time, President Kennedy didn't realize that at the height of the crisis, that the Russians had submarines armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes, tactical weapons. And at one point, one of these submarines was being hunted down by U.S. destroyers with depth charges, and they were trying to get it to surface, part of the blockade of Cuba at the time. And the captain of this submarine actually gave the order to release one of these torpedoes. And this story actually comes from my colleague Marty Sherwin, whose last book published just a year before he died, called Gambling with Armageddon. He discovered this, wrote extensively about this story. Anyway, this Russian captain gave the order to release one of these torpedoes, which would have destroyed a fleet of American destroyers off the coast of Cuba, and probably initiated an exchange of nuclear weapons. It's just horrendous. But fortunately, as it happened, just by pure chance, by pure luck, a high-ranking apparatchik, a member of the Communist Party, was on that submarine and was able to countermand the order and say, no, you can't do that. And that's how close we came to a nuclear war in Cuba in October of 1962. Well, Oppenheimer wasn't aware of this story, but he was aware of the dangers. And he had spent, his life after Hiroshima trying to warn the country about this. So here we are again on the brink of nuclear war in the Ukraine, of all places. It's human folly. What can I say?
Did your work on this book, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, inform and shape your thoughts about nuclear weapons today?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It's a story for our time. We've gotten used to living with the bomb. And if you read American Prometheus, and I hope many more people read this book after Christopher Nolan's movie next summer comes out, I think it's going to be terrific. And he explores many of these issues. And the movie is heavily based on the book, and much of the dialogue comes out of the book. And it's a reminder that we should never learn to live with the bomb. We've become too complacent in this nuclear age, and the story is not over. And if we accidentally get into a nuclear exchange, it could, as President Biden used the word the other day, it could lead to Armageddon. And unnecessarily, I would argue.
Kai Bird won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for the book that he co-authored, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. I believe the movie's called just simply Oppenheimer when it comes out next year. Kai Bird is also a member of the editorial board of The Nation magazine, where he has an editorial called Not Even Nuclear War Will Stop the Fighting in Ukraine. He's also executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. Kai Bird, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you for having me, Mitch. It was fun talking to you.